History is filled with moments of grandeur, victories that have shaped nations, altered destinies, and defined eras. But not all moments are born from triumph. Some are born from failure. There are moments in history when empires, kings, and armies believed their plans were unstoppable, only to see them crumble into chaos. When every calculation, every strategy, every hope was dashed against the harsh reality of war. These are the stories of the costliest military failures, where the weight of ambition, hubris, and miscalculation fell heavy on the shoulders of those who believed they could change the course of history. In the dark hours of these battles, where lives were gambled and futures lost, we witness not just the collapse of armies, but the disintegration of empires, the shattering of dreams, and the relentless march of fate. From the sand-swept beaches of Normandy to the frost-bitten streets of Stalingrad, these failures came at a staggering cost. But they also forged the path to new beginnings. What happens when the mightiest of forces meet their match? What happens when the unthinkable occurs, and even the strongest are brought to their knees? In these stories you will find the answers, and you'll understand why some of the most catastrophic failures became the turning points that reshaped the world forever. The echoes of these moments still resonate today. Prepare to dive into the heart of history's most unforgettable military blunders. The charge of the Light Brigade, a blunder of epic proportions. It was the morning of October 25, 1854, and the battlefield stretched out in a haze of smoke and uncertainty. The Crimean War had raged on for months, a brutal clash between Russia and the combined forces of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. The British were entrenched on the hills above the Russian fortress of Sevastopol, their eyes fixed on the battlefield below. Among them, the officers strategized with a quiet intensity, but no one could have anticipated the tragedy that would unfold that day. At the head of the British forces was Lord Raglan, an officer whose judgment had begun to falter in the face of mounting pressure. The situation was dire, and Raglan, tired and weary from the constant strain of the campaign, had a singular focus: the Russian artillery. It was pounding relentlessly on the British supply lines, threatening to cripple the entire operation. Lord Raglan's mind raced. He had to act, and quickly. In the chaos of the battlefield, he issued an order, a vague, urgent command that would later haunt the pages of history. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance and take the guns. It was a simple instruction, but one that would be interpreted in ways that no one could foresee. The Light Brigade, a crack unit of British cavalry known for their speed and bravery, was poised for action. They were to charge, to strike at the heart of the Russian forces. But what exactly were they to target? The ambiguity of the command left room for deadly misinterpretation. At the front of the Light Brigade was Lord Cardigan, a man who was confident in his men's abilities but, like his commander, not entirely clear on the mission at hand. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the battlefield, but the fog of war clouded his judgment. With a brief nod, he gave the order to charge. As the cavalry began their advance, the scene on the field was one of surreal confusion. The Light Brigade, a force of 600 men, thundered across the valley. They could see the Russian artillery in the distance. At least they thought they could. The truth was far worse. They were heading straight for the wrong position. The Russian heavy guns aimed directly at their own artillery, a target far beyond their original objective. The world seemed to slow as the cavalry rode into the deadly crossfire. The Russians, seeing the charge coming from the hills, began to open fire. The sound of cannon fire reverberated through the air, the thunderous explosions shaking the ground beneath them. The soldiers, their faces grim with determination, charged forward into the unknown. Every step they took brought them closer to death. The first of the cannonballs tore through the ranks, and the cavalrymen began to fall. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of wounded men. Yet the charge continued, the horses galloping toward their doom. The officers shouted orders that were drowned out by the barrage of artillery. But it was too late. The charge had begun, and it could not be stopped. The Light Brigade reached the Russian lines, but there was no glory to be found. Only devastation. The soldiers, dazed and confused, found themselves surrounded. Their objective had been misinterpreted. There was no grand victory, no breakthrough. Instead, there was only death. Minutes later, as the survivors staggered back, the full horror of the charge became apparent. Over 100 men lay dead, their bodies scattered across the battlefield. The survivors, shattered by the carnage, returned to their lines with their heads bowed in silence. What had gone wrong? The order, issued with such urgency, had been nothing more than a tragic miscommunication. The ambition for glory had turned into a nightmare. The charge of the Light Brigade would go down in history as one of the most infamous military blunders of all time. A simple misunderstanding, a lapse in judgment, and an unwavering commitment to an unclear command had led to the senseless loss of life. The world would remember the bravery of those men, but the real story would always be about the cost of leadership that failed to see the bigger picture. The charge of the Light Brigade was not just a military failure, it was a tragic moment in history where ambition, confusion, and poor communication converged into a catastrophic result. The Battle of Little Bighorn, the last stand of General Custer. It was June 25, 1876, and the sun beat down relentlessly on the vast plains of the American frontier. The air was thick with tension as General George Armstrong Custer, a man consumed with ambition and the lust for glory, prepared to make his move. The Battle of Little Bighorn was about to unfold, and Custer believed that this would be his moment, a moment of triumph that would secure his place in history. Custer, known for his aggressive tactics and youthful bravado, had risen to prominence in the U.S. Army. But that morning, as he surveyed the horizon, a sense of unease gripped him. His scouts had reported that the Native American forces he was pursuing were much larger than he had anticipated. But Custer, ever the optimist, shrugged off his doubts. He had seen adversity before, and he was determined to conquer this challenge just as he had conquered many before. As the 7th Cavalry advanced toward the Little Bighorn River, Custer could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The battlefield stretched out before him, the rolling hills and open plains an ideal stage for his cavalry to sweep through. He glanced at his officers, his eyes filled with determination. This was a fight he could not afford to lose. What Custer did not know, however, was that the enemy he faced was unlike any he had encountered before. Sitting Bull, the revered Lakota chief, had gathered a massive force of over 2,000 warriors. Their resolve was unshakable, and they had prepared for this very moment. While Custer's forces numbered only 600, he believed that his speed and superior tactics would win the day. But as the cavalry charged forward, a strange sense of unease rippled through the ranks. The terrain was unfamiliar, the heat unbearable. Custer's scouts had failed to spot the full extent of the Native American forces, and now it was too late. As Custer and his men charged toward the river, they encountered a wall of resistance, native warriors hidden in the brush, waiting for the right moment to strike. The initial skirmishes were brief but brutal. The soldiers, caught off guard by the ferocity of the assault, tried to regroup. But Custer had made a grave mistake. His plan to divide his forces, to attack from multiple directions, had only served to scatter them. The men were isolated, their positions overrun by the relentless tide of Native American warriors. It was chaos. The sound of gunfire and the cries of the wounded filled the air as the cavalrymen tried to hold their ground. But the enemy was too strong, too numerous. Every attempt to break through the lines was met with fierce resistance. Custer's forces were slowly being pushed back, and the realization began to set in: the battle was lost. As the hours passed, the situation grew dire. Custer, always confident, now understood the gravity of his mistake. He had underestimated his enemies, overestimated his own strength, and divided his forces at the wrong time. The Lakota warriors, led by Crazy Horse, encircled the 7th Cavalry, cutting off any chance of escape. By late afternoon, it was clear that the battle was over. Custer and his men had been overwhelmed. The survivors, few in number, were either killed or captured. The last stand of General Custer would go down in history as a symbol of both bravery and hubris. The Battle of Little Bighorn was not just a military failure. It was a moment in history where a man's pride, his obsession with victory, led him to miscalculate, to overreach. The loss was not just a military defeat, but the loss of a vision, one of conquest, one that would never come to pass. The news of the battle's outcome spread like wildfire. The world was stunned. The legendary general, once untouchable, had fallen. The story of Custer's last stand would forever be remembered, not as a tale of glory, but as a stark reminder of the dangers of overconfidence, poor strategy, and the price of pride. 3. The invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord. It was the early hours of June 6, 1944. The sky above the beaches of Normandy was dark and heavy with the weight of anticipation. The world was at war. The Allied forces had been planning the largest amphibious invasion in history for over a year, and today, it was finally happening. The stakes were higher than ever. This was the turning point of World War II. Success would pave the way for the liberation of Europe. Failure, however, could result in the collapse of the Allied effort. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, sat alone in his tent, reading over the final plans one last time. The invasion was a monumental gamble, and the pressure weighed heavily on him. Everything was riding on this operation. His mind raced as he reviewed the details: 5,000 ships, 13,000 aircraft, and 156,000 soldiers from various nations, all converging on 5 beaches in Normandy: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. As Eisenhower sat there, a foreboding sense of doubt crept over him. What if the weather didn't cooperate? What if the Germans had anticipated this attack and were waiting in full force? The Allies had been gathering forces in southern England for months, and the German intelligence had failed to grasp the enormity of the operation. But no plan was without its risks, and no one knew that better than Eisenhower. He had already given the order to proceed. The die was cast. The soldiers were already on their way. At this very moment, thousands of men were boarding planes and ships, their hearts pounding with the weight of what they were about to face. Some were veterans, hardened by years of combat, but many were fresh faces, just weeks into their training. None of them truly knew what awaited them on the beaches. The invasion would come in waves. Airborne troops would parachute behind enemy lines to capture key positions, while the amphibious assault would land on the beaches. The first wave of soldiers would face the brutal German defenses, which had been fortified for years. High cliffs, machine gun nests, barbed wire, and trenches awaited them. The Germans were dug in, confident that no army would dare assault the heavily defended coastline. And so it began. At 00:15, thousands of airborne troops were dropped into the darkness behind enemy lines. The planes were flying low, their engines roaring through the night air, and the men inside could hear the pounding of their hearts in their ears. It was terrifying, but they had trained for this moment, and they had to trust that their commanders knew what they were doing. The drop zones were chaotic. Some paratroopers landed far from their objectives, others scattered into enemy territory, but all were determined. In the thick of the chaos, one thing was clear: the war had come to Normandy. The battle was on. Hours later, As the sun began to rise, the first wave of the amphibious assault hit the beaches. The men were packed tightly into landing crafts, their eyes filled with fear and determination. The ocean was choppy, and the air was thick with the smell of salt and gunpowder. They knew they were heading into hell, but there was no turning back. As the landing crafts neared the beaches, the soldiers were met with the deafening roar of German artillery. Shells rained down, creating explosions in the water and sending plumes of smoke and debris into the sky. The first wave of troops began to disembark, but they were met with immediate resistance. The Germans were waiting for them, their machine guns raking the sand, cutting down soldiers in an instant. The men who survived the landing ran for cover, ducking behind whatever they could find: rocks, obstacles, even the bodies of their fallen comrades. There was no retreat. They pressed forward, inch by inch, under the relentless fire of the enemy. The Americans fighting on Omaha Beach were facing the worst of it. The German defenses were unyielding, and the men were pinned down, unable to move forward. They were trapped in a killing field. It seemed as though the beach would be their tomb. The tide of war could have turned right there, but the soldiers held their ground, pushing past their fear, driven by a single goal: to survive and break through. Hours passed, and the beach was littered with the dead and the wounded. The men of the 29th Infantry and 1st Infantry Divisions fought valiantly, but it was a brutal, agonizing struggle. The enemy, entrenched on the cliffs, had the high ground. Yet the men on the beach continued to press forward, even as they lost so many. But the tide was beginning to turn. The weather, which had been unpredictable, cleared just enough for the air support to arrive. Waves of bombers and fighter planes swooped in, strafing the German positions, giving the men on the ground a brief moment of respite. The breakthrough came at a cost, but it was now possible. By the end of the day, the Allied forces had secured the beachheads, but the battle was far from over. It would take weeks of brutal fighting to secure the entire Normandy region, and the men who had fought so hard that day would never forget the horrors they faced on those beaches. The victory at Normandy marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but the cost was enormous. Operation Overlord was a success, but it was a success forged in blood. Eisenhower's gamble had paid off, but the world would never forget the price that had been paid. The soldiers who stormed those beaches would forever be remembered for their courage and sacrifice. And as for General Eisenhower, he would later say, "The hope and the future of our world were on that beach." The Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point of World War II. The streets of Stalingrad were littered with rubble, smoke, and the remains of what had once been a thriving city. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a sickly yellow light over the ruins. It was late summer in 1942, and the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had entered its darkest chapter. The German army had pushed deep into Soviet territory, but Stalingrad, an industrial city on the Volga River, was the last obstacle standing between them and ultimate victory in the East. For months, Adolf Hitler had set his sights on Stalingrad. The city held symbolic and strategic value. It was named after the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, and its capture would deal a blow to Soviet morale. But beyond that, it was a vital industrial hub, and controlling it would sever Soviet supply lines. On the other side, Soviet General Vasily Chuikov had been tasked with holding the city at all costs. He knew the battle would be brutal, but there was no choice. Stalin had given him a single command: not a step back. The fate of the Soviet Union seemed to hinge on this city. Both sides knew it, and the war for Stalingrad would soon become a test of endurance, willpower, and sheer brutality. As the Germans advanced, the city's defenders fought fiercely, using the crumbling buildings and streets as their battlefield. There were no front lines in Stalingrad, just a chaotic, vicious street-to-street, house-to-house fight. The city was like a furnace, with temperatures soaring during the summer and freezing in the winter. The air was thick with smoke, the sound of artillery echoing through the streets, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. In the early stages of the battle, the Germans seemed unstoppable. Their panzers rumbled through the streets, and their air force bombed the city into oblivion. But the Soviets would not surrender. They dug in, fought back, and used every available resource to resist the German invaders. The civilians, many of them women and children, joined the fight, handing ammunition to the soldiers and tending to the wounded. They fought for survival, for their homes, and for their lives. The battle raged on for months, with both sides taking heavy losses. As winter set in, the Germans found themselves increasingly trapped. Supplies dwindled, and their forces grew weaker by the day. The Soviets had launched a counteroffensive, encircling the German Sixth Army and trapping them in a deadly pocket. General Friedrich Paulus, the German commander, realized too late the gravity of the situation. Hitler had refused to allow a retreat, ordering his troops to fight to the death. As the Soviets closed in, the German forces were left without food, medicine, or ammunition. The cold was unbearable, and the soldiers began to succumb to hunger and disease. The siege of Stalingrad had become a war of attrition. The German forces, once confident of victory, were now on the brink of annihilation. The Soviets had shown the world that they would not back down, no matter the cost. The German Sixth Army was trapped, and on February 2, 1943, after months of grueling combat, they were forced to surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point in World War II. It was the first major defeat for the Nazis and marked the beginning of a long and brutal Soviet counteroffensive that would eventually push the Germans back to Berlin. The loss at Stalingrad shattered Hitler's dream of a quick victory in the East and proved that the Soviet Union was not an empire to be easily conquered. The battle had come at an enormous cost. Over 2 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, had perished in the battle, making it one of the deadliest confrontations in history. Yet, in the cold, grim aftermath, the Soviet victory at Stalingrad represented something far greater than just a military triumph. It symbolized the resilience of a people determined to fight for their survival, no matter the odds. Stalingrad would forever be remembered as a place where men fought, bled, and died in the name of survival. And for those who lived to tell the tale, the echoes of the battle would stay with them forever. The fall of the Roman Empire, the end of an era. It was a time of upheaval, of chaos, of uncertainty. The year was 476 AD, and the once mighty Roman Empire, which had ruled over much of the known world for centuries, was on the brink of collapse. The great city of Rome, once the heart of an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, was now a shadow of its former glory. Its streets, once filled with the hustle and bustle of commerce, were now quiet and abandoned. The great monuments, the towering columns, the magnificent structures that had symbolized the might of the Romans, stood in ruin, slowly being consumed by time. But it wasn't just the city of Rome that was in decline. The empire itself was crumbling from within. Internal corruption, political instability, and constant invasions from barbarian tribes had weakened the empire to the point of no return. The once unshakable foundation of Roman power was disintegrating, and no one could predict what would come next. The empire that had once been the envy of the world was now teetering on the edge of its final downfall. In the West, the situation was especially dire. The Roman Empire had been divided into two halves, with the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, still holding its ground, while the Western Empire had become a fragmented shell of what it once was. Its last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was little more than a puppet, unable to wield the power once held by his predecessors. The throne, once occupied by titans like Augustus and Trajan, was now held by a weak and ineffective ruler. In the year 476, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer stood on the cusp of a historic moment. He was a leader of the barbarian mercenaries who had been serving in the Roman army for years, and he had watched with growing contempt as the empire weakened further. Odoacer had been born in a time when the Roman Empire was already in decline, and he had seen firsthand the rot that had taken root within its walls. He knew that Rome was no longer the power it once was. It was a dying giant, crippled by its own excesses, arrogance, and failures. Odoacer had grown tired of serving a distant emperor who lacked the strength to command respect. His men, too, had become disillusioned with the crumbling empire. The time had come for a new order, for the barbarians to take what they believed was theirs. The Roman Empire, which had once crushed barbarians beneath its boot, was now vulnerable, ripe for the taking. And so, in the summer of 476, Odoacer made his move. With his army of barbarian soldiers, he marched on Rome, determined to overthrow the last vestiges of Roman power in the West. The city, once protected by the legions of Rome, was now vulnerable to the mercenaries who had served in its own army. The walls of the great city, which had withstood countless sieges in centuries past, were now no match for the forces arrayed against them. Romulus Augustulus, the young emperor, was not prepared for what was coming. His reign had been a mere formality, a figurehead placed on the throne by his father, the general Orestes, who had essentially ruled in his stead. When Odoacer's forces arrived at the gates of Rome, the young emperor was powerless. His soldiers, once the pride of the empire, were now a ragtag group, incapable of resisting the onslaught of the barbarians who had served them for so long. Odoacer, with his army in tow, made his way into the heart of the city. The streets of Rome, once bustling with Roman citizens and the great procession of emperors, were now eerily quiet. The inhabitants of the city, having long lost faith in their leaders, simply watched as the barbarians approached. It was a scene that had once been unimaginable. Rome, the eternal city, was being overrun by the very people it had once sought to conquer. As Odoacer entered the palace, he found the emperor, Romulus Augustulus, waiting for him. The young emperor, who had little to no power, was handed his fate on a silver platter. Odoacer did not kill him, as many would have expected. Instead, he took the emperor's crown and, in a gesture of symbolic finality, dismissed him from the throne. "You are no longer emperor," Odoacer declared. "The Roman Empire in the West is no more." The Roman Empire, which had once stretched from the sands of Africa to the cold of Britain, had fallen. There was no great battle to mark its end, no final cataclysmic clash. It simply ended. The world had shifted, and the once great empire was no longer a dominant force on the world stage. The fall of the Roman Empire in the West had come not from a single decisive blow, but from years of decay, corruption, and neglect. As Romulus Augustulus left the throne room, a young man without a kingdom, he walked out of the gates of Rome for the last time. The great city that had once been the center of the world was now in the hands of a barbarian chieftain, and the age of Rome was over. The Western Roman Empire, which had endured for over 1,000 years, had finally come to its end. The story of Rome's fall was not just the story of a single empire's demise. It was the story of the shift in power from the old world to the new, from the might of Rome to the growing influence of the barbarian tribes. The fall of Rome marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, the Dark Ages. But the memory of Rome would never truly fade. Its legacy would live on in the art, philosophy, and architecture it had left behind. The Western Roman Empire might have fallen, but the shadow of Rome would continue to loom over the world for centuries to come. For Odoacer, however, the victory was bittersweet. The fall of Rome did not mark the creation of a new empire. Instead, it set the stage for further fragmentation and chaos. The empire that had once ruled over the known world was gone, but its legacy, both glorious and tragic, would live on for centuries. Odoacer, though victorious, would never know the power of the emperors who had ruled from Rome's golden age. He had conquered a dying empire, but in doing so, he had sealed the fate of a world that would never be the same.